It started on a Sunday afternoon, one of those gentle, ordinary days that make you forget how fragile peace really is. The rain had stopped an hour earlier, leaving the air thick and clean, the sky brushed with the pale blue of late autumn. Ethan and I were sitting on the living room floor of his apartment, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes and the faint smell of coffee. I'd just moved in a week earlier, and it felt like the first step towards something real, something steady. After years of living alone in a house that still echoed with my mother's voice, I was finally trying to build a new life. He was showing me old family photos, flipping through worn leather albums filled with sunlit smiles, Christmas mornings, and childhood summers that all looked like they belonged to a softer world. "That's my dad," he said, pointing to a tall man in sunglasses. "And that's Mom, before she decided bangs were a bad idea." I laughed, tracing the photo with my fingertip, warm from the nostalgia that didn't even belong to me. Then, as he turned another page, something caught my eye. A photo from a 4th of July barbecue, the kind with sparklers and red plastic cups and a crowd of people blurred in the background. It wasn't the fireworks or his grin that froze me. It was her. In the corner, half hidden behind a group of laughing neighbors, stood a woman. Her head was turned slightly, her hair pulled back, sunlight glinting off the small silver locket she never took off. My chest tightened. I leaned closer, my fingers trembling as I reached for the album. "Wait," I whispered. "Who's that?" Ethan glanced over. Oh, just some family friend, I guess. That was ages ago." But my pulse was pounding so hard I could barely hear him. I knew that face. Even through the faded film, even in the corner of someone else's life, I knew it. The curve of her jaw, the gentle slope of her nose, the way her hands rested calmly in front of her, like she was always holding something fragile. "Ethan," I said, my voice cracking, "that's my mother." He laughed softly, confused. "What? No, babe, that picture's from when I was like 8. How could—" But I was already on my feet, flipping through the pages, searching. My heart was racing as if it was trying to escape the impossible. And then I found another one, a Christmas photo, his family sitting around a huge tree, tinsel everywhere. And there she was again, in the background, near the doorway, her face softer this time, smiling faintly at something outside the frame. The same face, the same locket. My mother, who had died 13 years ago, when I was 15. My hands went cold. The room started to tilt, the edges of the photos blurring together. "You said this was your family's house. Where was this taken?" He frowned. "The old place, upstate. We moved when I was a teenager." "Do you still have the address?" "Why?" "Please," I said, trying to steady my voice. "Just tell me." He gave me a wary look. "Yeah, but what's going on?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was a blur of images. My mother in the kitchen, her laughter, the smell of her perfume, the way she used to hum while folding laundry. And now, her face, decades younger, frozen in a stranger's photo. That night, I couldn't sleep. The photo burned behind my eyelids, replaying over and over like a film reel that wouldn't stop spinning. I sat at the edge of the bed, scrolling through my phone, pulling up the only photo I had of her wearing that exact locket, the one I had buried her with. My heart dropped into my stomach. The photo in Ethan's album wasn't just similar, it was the same locket, the same tiny scratch near the clasp. I tried to tell myself it was a coincidence, that grief was making me see ghosts where there weren't any. But deep down, I knew what I saw. By morning, I was sitting in the kitchen, still clutching the album. When Ethan came out, rubbing sleep from his eyes, he stopped when he saw me. "You didn't sleep," he said quietly. I looked up, the weight of a truth I couldn't name sitting heavy in my chest. "Ethan," I whispered, "how did my mother end up in your family photos?" He blinked, caught between confusion and something else I couldn't name. "What are you saying?" I turned the album toward him, tapping the photo. This isn't just some random woman. That's her. I'd know her anywhere. He studied it for a moment, then shook his head. Anna, my mom probably just knew her or something. Small towns overlap, right? My mother grew up 2 states away. She'd never even been here. Then maybe it's just someone who looks like her. His tone was soft, the way you talk to someone fragile. But I wasn't fragile. I was terrified, because the universe doesn't make mistakes this specific. I closed the album slowly, my hands trembling. Where are your parents now? I asked. My mom's in Boston. Dad passed away a few years ago. I nodded, heart pounding. I want to talk to her. He frowned. About what? About how my mother ended up in your childhood. For a long moment, he just stared at me, torn between disbelief and something else I couldn't name. Then he said quietly, "Okay, but I think you should be prepared for whatever answer you get." I looked down at the photo again. My mother's faint smile frozen behind time, behind truth, behind a life I didn't understand. "So do I whispered. The following week, the photo wouldn't leave my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, standing in the corner of someone else's memory, smiling like she belonged there. I kept telling myself it wasn't possible. My mother died 13 years ago. Ethan's photo was taken almost 20 years ago. And yet, the locket, the expression, even the faint scar above her eyebrow, it was her. It had to be her. The more I stared at it, the less it felt like a coincidence and more like a message, something buried in time that was finally clawing its way back up. Ethan kept trying to calm me down, saying maybe our families crossed paths somehow. But I knew my mother's life like I knew my own heartbeat. Quiet, small, contained. She'd worked as a nurse, loved old records, and never once mentioned knowing anyone named Callahan, Ethan's family. Still, I needed to hear it from someone who was there. Ethan's mother, Linda, lived in a townhouse outside Boston, a neat, spotless place that smelled faintly of lemon polish and loneliness. She greeted us politely when we arrived, her smile tight but kind. I'd met her once before, briefly, but this time I couldn't shake the feeling she was studying me. Her eyes lingered on my face a moment too long, the corners of her mouth twitching like she was remembering something. "It's so good to see you again," she said, motioning for us to sit. "What brings you two here?" Ethan glanced at me, uncertain, and I took a breath. "Actually, I wanted to ask you about something," I said. "A photo from years ago." Her smile faltered just slightly. "What kind of photo?" I pulled the album from my bag and opened to the page that had haunted me all week. "This one," I said, sliding it across the table. "This woman in the background, do you know her?" Linda leaned closer, squinting, her fingers brushing the edge of the photo. For a moment, her expression softened, recognition flickering in her eyes, but then she blinked it away. "I'm sorry," she said lightly, closing the album a little too fast. "It was a long time ago. People came and went at those gatherings all the time." "You don't remember her?" I asked. "No," she said, too quickly. I looked at Ethan. He frowned. "Mom, are you sure? She thinks it might be—" "I said I don't remember," she interrupted, her tone sharp, final. The silence that followed was heavy, awkward, filled with the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of her bracelets clinking as she folded her hands. Finally, she forced a small laugh. "You two really came all the way here for that?" she said, trying to smooth the tension. "It's probably just someone who looked familiar. You know how old photos can play tricks on memory." But her voice was trembling, and I wasn't imagining that. After lunch, Ethan went outside to take a call, and I found myself alone with her. She stood by the sink, refilling her glass with water, avoiding my eyes. "Mrs. Callahan, please, I'm not trying to start anything. I just need to know. That woman, she looks exactly like my mother." Her hand froze. Slowly, she turned, and for a brief second, all the warmth drained from her face. Then she blinked it away. "What was your mother's name?" "Clara," I said. "Clara Bennett." The glass slipped from her hand, shattering against the tile. She didn't even flinch, just stood there, staring at me as if I'd said something impossible. "Did you say Bennett?" she whispered. "Yes." She sank into a chair, her breath shallow. Oh my God. When Ethan came back inside, she stood quickly, her composure returning like a mask snapping back into place. "You two should go," she said, forcing a smile. "It's been a long day." "Mom!" "Now, Ethan." Her voice left no room for argument. I followed him out, my heart pounding, and before we left, I looked back. She was still standing at the window, staring at me with an expression that was equal parts fear and sorrow. That night, I couldn't let it go. "She knew her," I said, pacing the living room. "You saw her face. She knew." Ethan rubbed his temples. "Maybe she did, but she clearly doesn't want to talk about it." "Why not?" I snapped. "Why hide something like that?" "Because maybe it's painful," he said quietly. "My dad died a few years ago, remember? What if it's connected to that?" "What if it's connected to her?" I countered. He sighed. "Anna, I love you, but you're scaring me. You're chasing ghosts." Maybe I was, but ghosts don't show up in photographs. I waited until he fell asleep that night and went back to the album. There were more photos tucked behind the pages, some loose, some stuck to the back cover. I pulled them out carefully, holding them under the lamplight. And there she was again, my mother. Not in the background this time, in the center, standing beside Ethan's father, smiling, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. The photo was dated August 1996, 2 years before I was born. My knees went weak. I sank to the floor, staring at their faces. The warmth, the familiarity, the way she looked at him like she'd known him forever. My mother had never mentioned another man. She'd never mentioned the Callahans, Boston, any of it. But this wasn't just chance. This was a connection that existed long before Ethan and I ever met. The next morning, I confronted him. "Your mother lied," I said, my voice shaking. "My mom and your dad, they knew each other." I held out the photo, my hands trembling. He took it, staring in disbelief. "That's impossible," he murmured. "My dad, he was married to my mom since college. He would never—" "Then why is my mother in your family photo albums?" I asked. He didn't answer. He just looked at me, confusion and fear flickering across his face. Then he whispered, "I think I need to talk to my mother again." As he turned away, my gaze dropped to the photograph one last time. Behind them, a mirror hung on the wall, and in its reflection, just barely visible, was a child's crib. My stomach turned cold. My mother's hand wasn't just resting on his shoulder. She was wearing her locket, the one that was supposed to hold my baby photo. By the next morning, I knew I couldn't wait for Ethan to talk to his mother. The answers I needed were no longer in Boston or in the photos. They were buried somewhere in the years before I was born. So I packed a small bag, printed the photos, and drove 6 hours north to the town where my mother had grown up, a place she'd only ever mentioned in passing. The closer I got, the more I felt like I was driving backward through time. The landscape shifted from city glass to quiet trees and crumbling fences. The air smelled of pine and rain, and the road signs looked older, hand-painted, like the world here had decided to stop moving somewhere around 1998. I stopped at a small diner near the edge of town, the kind where the waitress already knows your name before you say it. When I told her mine, she blinked. "Bennett?" she asked, tilting her head. "Like Clara Bennett?" My heart stuttered. "You knew her?" The waitress smiled faintly. "Everybody knew Clara. Sweet girl. Moved away real sudden, though. What brings you back?" I hesitated, my hands tightening around my coffee cup. "Just trying to learn more about her." The waitress nodded slowly, her eyes softening. "You should talk to the library. Miss Howard keeps everything. Newspapers, photos, records. If your mama lived here, she's in those books somewhere." The library sat at the edge of Main Street, its white paint chipped and peeling, but inside the air smelled like dust and memory. Miss Howard was exactly who'd you'd imagine, a woman in her 70s with glasses on a chain and a voice that could hush an entire town. When I explained who I was, she smiled like she'd been waiting for me. "Clara Bennett," she said, flipping through a binder with the care of someone handling glass. "Now there's a name I haven't heard in a while. She worked at the Callahan estate for a few summers, took care of their boy while his parents traveled." My stomach dropped. "You mean Ethan's father?" Miss Howard nodded. "Yes, the older one. Handsome devil. Always driving that red convertible around. The Callahans owned half the town back then. Clara was barely 20. Sweet girl, but there was talk. Talk? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Ms. Howard gave me a look over her glasses. People said she got too close to her employer. Nothing proven, of course, but folks love a scandal. Then she left town, sudden-like. Married a man from out of state, I heard. Had a baby not long after. My throat went dry. I thought of my birth certificate, the blank space where my father's name should have been. Do you know what year she left? I asked. Ms. Howard flipped through another binder, humming softly. Summer of '96, she said finally. Funny thing is, the Callahans left that same month. Never came back after that. I thanked her, barely hearing my own voice as I left. Outside, the air felt heavy, the kind of weight that settles in when truth starts to take shape. I drove to the edge of town where the old Callahan estate still stood. It was smaller than I'd imagined, abandoned now, vines crawling up the porch and windows clouded with dust. The gate was open, and something in me, curiosity, madness, grief, made me walk through. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of decay. I wandered from room to room, trying to imagine my mother here, young and alive, her laughter echoing down these same halls. In the study, I found a stack of old photo frames leaning against the wall. Most were empty, but one still held a faded picture behind cracked glass. My hands shook as I pulled it free. It was the same summer photo from Ethan's album, the barbecue, the smiles, but in this version, the edges weren't cropped. And there, clear as sunlight, was my mother's full face. She was standing closer to Ethan's father now, almost touching his arm. But it wasn't her expression that made my breath catch. It was what she was holding, a small child, barely a year old, with curly brown hair and eyes that looked exactly like mine. The room spun. I stumbled backward, clutching the frame to my chest. My mother hadn't just worked for Ethan's family. She'd loved someone there. And that baby, no, it couldn't be, but my heart already knew. My knees gave out, and I sank to the dusty floor, the picture trembling in my hands. My mother had left this town carrying a secret no one had ever told me, that I wasn't just connected to the Callahans by coincidence. I was part of them. When I got back to the car, I called Ethan. My voice was shaking so badly I could barely speak. I found something, Ethan. Something about your dad and my mom. There was a long silence on the other end. Then he said, very quietly, You need to come home. My mom just called me. She wants to talk to both of us. She said she should have told us the truth years ago. The line went dead before I could respond. I sat there for a long time, the photo frame on the passenger seat, my reflection staring back at me from the cracked glass. Behind me, the house stood silent, but I could almost feel my mother there, her presence in every shadow. And for the first time, I realized the woman I'd been chasing through photographs wasn't haunting me, she was guiding me home. When I got back home that night, the air felt too still, too heavy, like the world was holding its breath. Ethan was waiting on the porch, his hands buried deep in his jacket pockets, his face pale under the porch light. The second our eyes met, I knew his mother had told him something he wasn't ready to repeat. She's inside, he said quietly, stepping aside. I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway as I entered, that slow, steady rhythm that always seemed to echo through houses that held too many memories. Linda sat at the dining table, her shoulders slumped, a cup of untouched tea in front of her. She looked smaller than before, like the weight of the past had finally started to crush her. Sit down, Anna, she said softly. There's a lot you deserve to know. I sat, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear her at first. You were right, she said after a long pause. Your mother and my husband knew each other. They were close, closer than I wanted to believe. When she worked for us that summer, I thought it was innocent. She took care of Ethan, helped around the house, and your mother was kind. She had this light about her, this peace. My husband, Robert, was drawn to that. Her hands twisted around her teacup. At first, I told myself it was harmless, but by the end of that summer, I knew. They were having an affair. My stomach twisted, my fingers curling against the table. You knew? I whispered. And you didn't say anything? Her eyes filled with tears. I confronted her. She tried to explain, said she was leaving, said she was pregnant. I told her if she ruined my family, I'd ruin her. I didn't mean it. At least I didn't think I did, but I said it anyway. A week later, they both disappeared. He told me he was ending it, that he'd never see her again. He came back alone. I thought it was over. I thought she'd moved on. She swallowed hard, looking down at her trembling hands. Then years later, I found out she died in a car accident. I didn't even know she'd had a daughter. The room swayed, her words settling over me like ash. So you knew about me? I said, my voice shaking. You knew and never... She shook her head. Not until recently. When Ethan brought you home, I recognized your face immediately. You have her eyes. I told myself it couldn't be, but when I saw your last name, I knew. You're Clara's daughter. Ethan stared between us, pale and speechless. Mom, he said finally, his voice cracking, what are you saying? She turned to him, her face breaking. I'm saying that the woman you love is the daughter your father left behind. The silence that followed was unbearable, a hollow ringing that filled every corner of the room. I couldn't breathe. Ethan's eyes widened, his lips parting like he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. My pulse roared in my ears. No, I whispered. No, that's not... It's true, she said softly. I had a DNA test done after you left last week. I needed to know. Your father was her father too. The floor seemed to drop out from under me. My chest burned and the edges of the room blurred. That's not possible, I said, my voice breaking. It can't be. But Linda's face told me everything. It was true. Ethan's father had been my mother's lover, my biological father, which meant Ethan and I... Ethan stood, backing away from the table, his eyes wide with disbelief. No, he said hoarsely. No, there's no way. That doesn't... How could you keep something like that from me? Tears filled Linda's eyes. I didn't know until now. I swear, I didn't know until I saw her, until I saw you together. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing, shaking his head like he could outrun what he'd just heard. We didn't do anything wrong. We didn't know. I wanted to speak, but no words came. My throat ached, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. The house suddenly felt suffocating, full of ghosts that refused to rest. I stood, pushing back from the table, and Linda reached for my hand. Anna, she said softly, I'm so sorry. Your mother loved you more than anything. She left to protect you from all of this. She didn't want you to grow up carrying their sins. I pulled my hand away, tears blurring my vision. She didn't protect me. She just postponed it. Ethan's voice broke through the silence. What now? He asked, looking at me, his eyes red. What are we supposed to do? I shook my head. There's nothing we can do. My voice trembled, the words tasting like heartbreak. The house suddenly felt suffocating, full of ghosts that refused to rest. I stood, pushing back from the table, and Linda reached for my hand. Anna, she said softly, your mother loved you more than anything. She left to protect you from all of this. She didn't want you to grow up carrying their sins. I pulled my hand away, tears blurring my vision. She didn't protect me. She just postponed it. Ethan's voice broke through the silence. What now? He asked, looking at me, his eyes red. What are we supposed to do? I shook my head. There's nothing we can do. My voice trembled, the words tasting like heartbreak. The night air hit me like a wave, cold and clean and cruel. I walked until my legs ached, until the tears stopped falling. The stars above looked distant, indifferent, like witnesses to something sacred breaking. My phone buzzed in my pocket, Ethan's name flashing across the screen, but I couldn't answer. Some truths, once spoken, don't need to be repeated. When I got home, I found the album still on the table where I'd left it. I opened it to the first photo, the barbecue, the background, her smile. My mother had been there all along, not to haunt me, but to lead me to this moment, to the truth she died trying to keep me from. For the first time, I didn't cry. I just closed the album gently and whispered, "I understand now, Mom." The weeks that followed passed in slow motion, like I was living underwater, watching the world move above me in soft, muffled echoes. The truth had settled over my life, like fog, thick and unrelenting. And every time I thought I'd found the surface, something else pulled me back down. Ethan and I hadn't spoken since that night. He'd tried, a few messages, one call, but what was there to say? Words couldn't untangle blood. They couldn't rewrite what we were or undo the tragedy of what our parents had done long before we were even born. I'd left his house with nothing but my mother's locket and the last photograph, the one of her holding that small child, me. I kept it on the table beside my bed, the same way she used to keep mine, a quiet reminder that love and guilt often share the same face. I thought about her a lot, about how lonely she must have been, how heavy her silence must have felt. For years, I'd hated that she never told me who my father was. I'd thought she was protecting herself, ashamed maybe, or afraid. But now I understood. She wasn't protecting her secret. She was protecting me. From the chaos I'd walk into like it was destiny. From the kind of truth that doesn't set you free. It just changes the shape of your cage. A month after everything unraveled, I went back to the town where she grew up. The leaves had started to change, gold and red and endless, the air crisp enough to sting my lungs. The Callahan estate was gone now, torn down after years of decay. In its place was an empty lot, surrounded by wildflowers. I stood at the fence, my coat pulled tight, the wind tugging at my hair, and for the first time, I didn't feel haunted. I felt found. "You knew I'd end up here," I whispered. "You always knew." As I turned to leave, I saw an old man sitting on a bench near the road, the same man who'd owned the diner where I'd stopped weeks earlier. He squinted up at me. "You Clara's girl?" he asked. I hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah," I said, softly. "I am." He smiled faintly. "She used to bring you here when you were little, said this was where she felt closest to God." My throat tightened. "I don't remember." "You were just a baby," he said, "but she'd sit right there, singing to you. Said she wanted you to grow up without the weight she carried." The words stayed with me long after I left. That night, I went back to my motel room and took out her locket. The hinge creaked when I opened it. The tiny photograph inside faded with time. Her holding me, her smile, soft, almost shy. Behind the photo, something small glimmered. I pried it loose carefully, heart pounding. It was a folded slip of paper, old and delicate, her handwriting still steady despite the years. "My Anna. If you ever find this, it means I couldn't tell you myself. I made mistakes, ones that cost me everything. But you were never one of them. You were the only right thing I ever did. Don't spend your life hating where you came from. You can't choose the truth, but you can choose what it makes of you. Love always, Mom." I pressed the note to my heart, my tears falling onto the faded ink. For so long, I'd chased her shadow, thinking she'd left me nothing but questions. But she'd left me something far greater, the strength to bear the answers. The next morning, I drove to the lake where she and I used to go when I was little. The air was cold and still, the surface of the water glassy and perfect. I sat at the edge, pulling my knees to my chest, and for the first time in months, I let myself breathe without flinching. I thought of Ethan, how his voice had cracked when he said my name that last night, how the pain in his eyes mirrored mine. Maybe in another life, one unburdened by their sins, we could have been something whole. But not this one. This life wasn't built for us. It was built from the rubble they left behind. As the sun rose, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the photograph, the one of my mother and me, whole, before the lies, before the silence. I tore it gently down the middle, separating her image from his. I set the half with her face against the water and watched it drift away, the paper curling, the ink bleeding. "You can rest now," I whispered. "I understand." I stayed there until the light changed, until the sun's reflection turned the surface into gold. When I finally stood, the world felt lighter, as if some invisible thread had finally let go. I didn't need to chase her anymore. She wasn't gone. She was in the echo of the wind, in the glimmer of the water, in every heartbeat that refused to stop loving despite the pain. When I got back into my car, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face framed by morning light, my mother's eyes staring back at me. For a moment, I smiled. Not because I was healed, but because I was still here. Still standing, still carrying her in every breath. And as I drove away from that town, the radio crackled softly, playing a song she used to hum, an old lullaby about finding your way home. I rolled the window down, letting the wind rush through, and whispered to the empty seat beside me, "I'm home now, Mom. You don't have to watch anymore." The road stretched ahead, endless and forgiving, and for the first time since she died, the reflection in the glass didn't haunt me. It smiled back.